Have you ever seen someone point at your wife like she was the neighborhood's most wanted criminal? I'll never forget that moment. The president of the HOA stood at the edge of our lawn, fingers shaking, voice cracking with rage, threatening to call the police because Angela, my quiet, Honda-driving wife, had simply said no thanks. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rude, just a calm refusal. Yet somehow that single word set off a storm that would consume our lives for months. 3 months ago, this neighborhood looked like everything we'd ever wanted. White picket fences, kids riding bikes until the streetlights hummed to life, the faint sound of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings. Angela and I had been hunting for a house for over a year, and Meadowbrook Estates seemed perfect. No HOA dues, no restrictions, just clean sidewalks and friendly waves. Freedom. I can still remember our realtor leaning in like he was passing along a secret. This one's outside the HOA mess. You'll be free and clear, just enjoy your home. He winked. At the time, I thought it was a nice bonus. I had no idea how important that would become. I'm Justin Roberts, high school history teacher. My life isn't flashy. My wife Angela works for the county. She always kept her job description vague, administrative stuff, boring paperwork, and I never pressed too hard. We're not the type of people who cause trouble. We drive used cars, clip coupons, and think Friday night pizza counts as a big evening. We moved here to blend in, not to stand out. The first 2 days in our new home were magic. The garage smelled of cardboard boxes and motor oil as I sorted through my old textbooks. Angela wandered barefoot through the backyard, already sketching out a vegetable garden in her mind. I remember hearing the squeak of the side gate as I carried in tools and thinking, this place feels alive. Neighbors passed by and waved. Betty from 2 houses down brought cookies. For a moment I thought, this is it, we found home. But on the 3rd morning, everything shifted. The doorbell rang while I was knee-deep in unpacked boxes. The chime echoed through the empty hallway, sharp and insistent. I wiped dust from my hands and peeked through the window. Standing there was a woman in her mid-40s, blonde hair cut into a perfect bob, a clipboard tucked under one arm. Even from behind the glass, I could feel her posture, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, like someone carrying authority. I opened the door. She smiled, the kind of smile you practice in a mirror. Good morning. I'm Diane Parker, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I'm here to welcome you to our wonderful community and discuss your membership. Her words hung in the air. Homeowners Association, the very thing we had avoided. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said carefully. We specifically bought a home outside the HOA that was important to us. Her smile twitched, faltered for half a second before snapping back into place. Well, that's not quite how it works in established communities like ours, she replied smoothly, flipping her clipboard. What do you do for work, Mr. Roberts? The question caught me off guard. I teach history high school. Her expression shifted, polite on the surface, but with a flicker of disappointment, like she'd expected something grander. Public school, how civic-minded of you. Then, without missing a beat, and your wife? Before I could answer, Angela appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. I'm Angela, I work in county government administration. Her voice was calm, polite, but I noticed she kept her answer deliberately vague. Diane's eyes sharpened. County government. She pressed for details, her tone just a shade too curious, too official. Angela stayed steady. Compliance, enforcement, boring stuff. I could feel the tension rising between them. Diane's probing curiosity against Angela's quiet refusal to give more than necessary. Diane launched into her pitch: property values, community standards, annual dues of $300. She held out glossy folders with charts, stamped documents with county seals. For a moment, even I wondered if we'd made a mistake. The paperwork looked real. My stomach tightened. Had we misunderstood? But Angela didn't flinch. She scanned the forms, closed the folder, and handed it back with a steady hand. Thank you, Mrs. Parker, but we're not interested in joining any homeowners association. Silence. Diane's smile froze, the mask slipping. This isn't a suggestion, she said finally, her voice colder. The community has expectations. People who don't participate often find it challenging. Angela met her stare, calm, firm, we'll manage. It was like watching 2 chess players lock eyes across a board. Diane's expression hardened, her body stiffening. She tucked her clipboard under her arm, but not before pulling out her phone. She began snapping pictures, our mailbox, our cars, even the license plate numbers. Just updating our neighborhood records, she said sweetly when she caught me watching. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked away, but I swear I felt the echo linger long after she disappeared. My stomach dropped. Those weren't neighborly photographs, that was surveillance. The next morning, taped to our front door like some kind of scarlet letter, was an official-looking notice stamped with Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I peeled it off with shaking fingers. violation citation, noncompliance, our grass too long, mailbox the wrong color, garden beds, aesthetic violations. It was absurd. We'd mowed days ago, our mailbox matched half the street, and Angela's shrubs were the same ones we'd seen neighbors buying. But as I read line by line, one truth hit me harder than the rest. This wasn't about grass or paint or shrubs. This was about punishment, retaliation for saying no. Angela sipped her coffee, eyes scanning the document with eerie calm. "These are harassment tactics dressed as official language," she murmured, her tone sharper than I'd ever heard it. "She's building a paper trail. This isn't the end, Justin, it's the beginning." Have you ever walked into a room and felt, without a word spoken, that you were the villain everyone had come to see? That's exactly what it felt like the night Diane called her so-called community meeting. It started with the flyers, brightly printed, stuffed into our mailbox until it bent under the weight. Concerned neighbors gathering, protecting property values together. The language was polite, but the timing and context couldn't have been clearer. This wasn't a friendly barbecue invite, it was a rally against us. I still remember pulling the paper from the stack of junk mail. The edges cut into my fingers as I unfolded it, and I felt my chest tighten. Angela, calm as ever, read it once and set it aside, sipping her coffee like she'd seen this all before. "Don't go," she said flatly. That's exactly what she wants. But I couldn't help myself. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe curiosity. Maybe some part of me thought if I showed up, if I just explained that we weren't trying to hurt anyone, people would see reason. By 7:15 that evening, I found myself in the community center, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, rows of metal chairs lined up in perfect order. About 20 neighbors were already seated, murmuring in low voices. A projector hummed against the far wall, casting a title slide in bold letters, "Protecting Property Values Together." Diane stood at the front, clipboard in hand, looking like a prosecutor preparing for trial. When she spotted me slipping into a chair near the back, her lips curled into something between a smirk and a challenge. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that wasn't asked for but demanded. "We're here tonight to discuss challenges that could threaten our community's standards, and by extension, the value of our homes. Slide 1, pristine lawns, bright mailboxes, perfectly trimmed hedges. Slide 2, the same homes, unkempt, circled in red. The message was obvious. This is what happens when we let people slip through the cracks." I tried to breathe slow, tried not to let the heat rise in my face, but then she clicked to slide 3 and my stomach flipped. Our house, high-resolution photos taken just yesterday, our mailbox circled in bright red, our lawn measured with exaggerated arrows, our shrubs labeled non-conforming. Neighbors shifted in their seats, murmuring. Some looked sympathetic, others suspicious. Diane didn't miss a beat. "Unfortunately," she said with mock sadness, "some newer residents seem to believe that community standards are optional, and when certain people refuse to participate, it creates negative impacts for everyone." She paused, letting her words settle like smoke. "The husband works in public education, admirable of course, but perhaps not the financial perspective one would expect from long-term homeowners committed to property value preservation." It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it, the implication, the suggestion that we didn't belong, that we couldn't afford to belong. I clenched my fists under the table, every instinct screamed to stand up, to shout that this was nonsense. But I didn't. Years of teaching unruly classrooms had trained me well. Sometimes silence was the only defense. Then from the back of the room, a voice broke the tension. "8 years here," Mike Davis said, leaning back in his chair. "Their place looks fine, identical fixtures to half the block." Murmurs rippled through the room. Diane's face tightened, but she recovered quickly, flipping to the next slide, a detailed breakdown of supposed violations, measurements, even landscaping comparisons. It looked official, too official. The kind of thoroughness you'd expect from a city inspector, not a nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands. I watched heads nodding around me, people persuaded by her charts and jargon. My heart sank. Facts didn't matter here, perception did. When the meeting ended, I slipped out quietly, but the glances followed me. Eyes darting, whispers low, the kind of silence that tells you people have already made up their minds. Back home, I dropped into the kitchen chair, the paper flyers still scattered across the counter. Angela sat across from me, expression unreadable, fingers tapping against her coffee mug. "She's building a case," Angela said finally. "Not a legal one, a psychological one. She's isolating us. That's how these campaigns work, create doubt, plant suspicion, make us look like the threat." Her words chilled me, not just because they made sense, but because of how she said them. with the cold precision of someone who had studied this before. I wanted to ask how she knew so much. I wanted to press about her administrative job, about why she seemed almost too prepared for this kind of neighborly warfare, but I didn't, not then. Instead, I tried to sleep. I tossed, turned, replayed every look from that meeting. Around 2 a.m., I jolted awake to the sound of movement outside, not raccoons, not cats, something heavier, intentional. Peeling back the curtain, I saw a beam of light sweep across the yard. A figure moved slowly, methodically, flashlight in hand, stopping at windows, testing the patio door. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would shake the glass. By the time I scrambled outside, they were gone. But the evidence remained. Patio furniture shifted, the garden hose stretched across the lawn, faint scratches along the sliding door frame. I stood there barefoot in the damp grass, my breath clouding in the night air, and realized this wasn't just harassment anymore. This was reconnaissance. Someone was studying us. Angela joined me minutes later, calm, robe tied tight, flashlight steady in her hand. She crouched by the scratches, measuring them with her fingers, snapping photos with her phone. "This is testing," she said quietly. "They're probing for weaknesses, entry points. This is escalation." Her voice was steady, but her eyes gave her away. Not fear, focus. The kind of focus you see in people trained to handle crises. I stared at her in the moonlight, questions crowding my throat. But before I could speak, she looked at me and said something that froze me more than the night air ever could. "Justin, this isn't just about Diane anymore. Someone else is watching us." Have you ever found a stack of photographs on your doorstep and felt your whole life tilt on its axis? That feeling, cold, hollow, impossible to ignore, hit me the afternoon I opened a plain manila envelope and pulled out what looked like proof that someone had been living outside our house, watching us like a TV show. The envelope had been slipped beneath the door, no return address, folded into the small creak of the threshold. Inside were architectural floor plans, room layouts, window placements, tiny notations in the margins, printed so cleanly it looked like they'd come from a professional drafter. There were also photographs, dozens of them. Angela leaving for work at 7:05 a.m., another of her getting into the Honda at 5:47 p.m., one of the same intersection where she usually turned left on Main. Each photo had a time scrawled beside it in neat handwriting, dates, notes, a cadence of obsession. My hands trembled as I tapped the photos against the kitchen table. The house suddenly felt too small, the air felt too loud. From the porch, I could hear a neighbor's dog barking the same tone as my heartbeat, 2 sharp yips, a pause, 2 sharp yips. For the first time, the simple phrase Angela used for her job, county administration, sounded like a deliberately vague shield. I remember thinking, someone knows our routines, someone has been recording them. I wanted to run next door, knock on Diane Parker's door and ask her no, accuse her of breaking into our life. But rationality still had me by the collar. Break-ins were criminal, assumptions were dangerous. So I did what people like me do. I documented, I took photos of the photos, I scanned the plans, I made copies. Angela watched me move through the motions like she had done this before, not panicked, not flustered, just methodical and efficient. "This isn't garden variety nosiness, Justin," she said softly, folding the plans like a surgeon closing a chart. "This is targeted surveillance, it's escalatory, someone is mapping our house and tracking her movements, that's a different level." Her voice didn't tremble, it didn't need to. The words themselves carried the weight. We spent the next day trying the obvious things, talking to neighbors, asking if anyone had seen odd activity, checking our ring footage. A few people shrugged or offered polite disbelief. "Maybe it's just a contractor," Mrs. CL down the block suggested, knitting brow furrowed. "Or a real estate agent." But the look in her eyes when I showed her the photos said something else. People can tell when they're being asked to look the other way. Not everyone turned away. Mike Davis, who'd already shown a spine at the HOA meeting, came over and looked through the envelope with a face that was gone suddenly sober. He set the plans down slowly and said, "This isn't amateur, that's detailed. Someone either had access to your interior plans or they've been really thorough in their observations." By the time Monday rolled around, the paperwork arrived, this time at our door in bold type and laminated for effect. A violation notice from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA listing a half-dozen infractions that were laughable in their specificity and malicious in their tone. Our mailbox was the wrong color, our grass was allegedly too long, our garden layout didn't conform to some invisible aesthetic monarchy. The violation number looked like bureaucratic theater. I peeled it off and felt the paper's edge against my palm like a slap. When I read it aloud in the kitchen, Angela didn't blink. She set the mug down, the sound soft against porcelain. "She's creating a narrative," she said. "A public record of persecution, a breadcrumb trail that makes later steps look like enforcement rather than personal vendetta." There was a calm ferocity in her analysis that made me proud and scared at the same time. If the plan had been to shame us into joining or to force us into submission, Diane's next move was audaciously theatrical. The entire neighborhood received glossy flyers, a meeting at 7 community center agenda maintaining property values. The language was civil, the intent was not. I remember holding the flyer in my hand and thinking how small a piece of paper can feel like a loaded gun when the person behind it has decided you're a target. The meeting was a theater of civility. Fluorescent lights hummed. A projector clicked. Deanne presented slides before and after photos of houses, arrows, circled borders, measurements down to millimeters that made everything feel calculated. The final slide, high-resolution photographs of our house circled in red, annotations accusing us of noncompliance. She talked about precedent and collective responsibility in the tone of someone who believed rhetoric could replace truth. I wanted to stand. I wanted to show the photos in the envelope, to shout that this woman had been watching us. But there was the teacher in me trained to contain a room, to choose words that kept my mouth shut. I listened while Diane spoke like a prosecutor, watched faces soften at the language of security, and felt the slow, stomach-sick recognition that reality can be massaged until a lie looks like common sense. Then the escalation that Officer Harris later called predictable happened in real time. That night, sometime after 2 a.m., I was jarred awake by scraping on the patio. A beam of light skittered past the bedroom curtains. In the thin, nervous light, I saw movement outside, shadows arranging the patio chairs, a hose pulled into an awkward line, a small cluster of footprints in the damp earth. Whoever had been there moved with purpose, circling entry points like a professional checking angles. This wasn't about intimidation anymore, it was reconnaissance. I grabbed my phone with hands that didn't feel like mine and dialed the non-emergency line. Officer Harris arrived before dawn with the gravel crunch of a patrol car and a tired kind of patience. He walked the yard with a measuring tape and a clipboard and then looked at us, his eyes kind but serious. People start with paperwork, he said quietly, and then they escalate. You document, you preserve, don't engage directly if you can help it, we'll make a note. He patted the folder Angela had compiled, photographs, times, text messages, and said, "This looks like someone is staging events to create an excuse for more invasive action." When we walked the neighborhood with the file showing our neighbors the photos, I expected outrage. I expected horror. Instead, I met something slippery: denial, embarrassment, an urge to make things small and domestic again. "Maybe she's just overzealous," one neighbor said, avoiding my eyes. "You know how some people get involved." Another offered the gentle, well-meaning advice: "Maybe talk to her, work it out." Talk to her? The absurdity of the suggestion made me laugh then, the kind of brittle sound that cracks in the throat. Talk to a woman who had been standing in our driveway at all hours, scribbling notes about tactical awareness and then leaving us architectural plans as a trophy? That wasn't conversation. That was accumulation of evidence. The next escalation was legal theater. Diane arrived the following week with a man in an expensive suit and a leather briefcase. The lawyer Henderson of Henderson & Associates handed me a thick envelope sealed with a sticker like a wax seal. Inside was a cease and desist filled with big words and hollow threats, alleging we were creating a dangerous precedent and harming the community's investments by refusing HOA membership. It was designed to sound like authority. Angela read through it, lip curling in the most controlled fashion. "These citations reference ordinances that don't exist," she said, tapping a line with a fingertip. "The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over our property." Henderson tried to stare down her quiet expertise to make the paperwork look heavier than it was. He failed. Angela's reply was clinical and simple: "Your client is harassing us. This is intimidation dressed as regulatory language. Stop or face real legal consequences." The lawyer left, his briefcase acting like a monument to wasted theater. Word spread, as it does in small towns, and more neighbors stopped by, some with cookies, some with questions. Betty watched Diane's march around the neighborhood and mulled aloud that Diane had a way of making you feel unpatriotic if you didn't agree with her. Mike, meanwhile, told me something that made the whole picture click into place. The HOA was in trouble financially. Diane had committed to projects assuming dues would rise. If membership didn't increase, she would be personally liable for thousands. So we were a scapegoat and a ledger entry wrapped in human skin. Someone had decided that our refusal to hand over $300 would be the hill on which she would die or win, and she had an appetite for escalation. That night, the anonymous email arrived. Subject line blank: "The body, your wife isn't who she says she is. Ask her about her real job." It landed like an accusation you could not sweep away. I read it, reread it again until words faded into static. Angela read it over my shoulder, then sat down very slowly. "People have been doing research," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me realize I had never fully known the full measure of the woman sitting across from me. The document in the envelope, the photos, the late-night reconnaissance, they had pierced something quiet and private, and the consequences were about to unfurl in ways I hadn't imagined. Have you ever listened to your own front lawn breathe and realized every rustle might be someone else's plan? That's the sound that kept me awake the week everything blew up. The soft scrape of tires on asphalt, the hush of voices carried too clearly in the cold air, the way the porch light made long shadows crawl across the driveway like watchful animals. After the envelope and the anonymous email, the house stopped feeling like ours. It felt like a stage we hadn't agreed to be in. Angela moved through it with a kind of quiet focus that made me both proud and afraid. She started changing small things without fanfare. She swapped the routes she took to work. She left at odd hours and came back different ways. She began taking phone calls in her car instead of in the kitchen. Little changes, simple, effective, almost invisible, designed to make patterns vanish like footprints in wind. One night I found her in the garage at midnight, flashlight in hand, checking the padlock on my old toolbox. The beam of light caught dust motes that hung like tiny planets in the air. She looked up at me with that same calm, professional expression I'd come to rely on. "They're watching for habits," she said, closing the toolbox and clicking the lock shut with clinical precision. "If we break the script, we make their lives harder." Her voice was normal, but there was no question in it. She decided this was her problem as much as mine. Meanwhile, Diane didn't slow. If anything, she sped up. Her social media posts started to take on a coordinated cadence, curated screenshots of our supposed infractions, plaintive appeals to property values, thinly veiled warnings about safety. The language was carefully neutral, civic-minded phrases that sounded reasonable on the surface, but beneath it was a current of accusation. People started commenting. Some took her at face value, others pushed back. The comment threads turned into little battlegrounds. Neighbors debating tone, who was right, what a community should be. It felt like watching a slow-motion pull of the neighborhood's soul. Then came the more concrete harassment. Our outdoor lights were tampered with, bulbs unscrewed and left dangling, floodlights pointed the wrong way, our garden hose was cut in 2 places, our welcome mat was found in the street one morning. Someone had been testing our reactions, seeing how far they could push before we answered. It was petty at first. Petty put together becomes pattern, and pattern becomes proof. One afternoon, Mike came by, boots scuffing the gravel as he approached. He frowned as he set a thick manila folder on the kitchen table. "I dug into some HOA stuff," he said, settling on the counter. "There's more here than just bad leadership. Diane's been committing to projects without board votes. If membership doesn't rise, she's out a lot of money personally." He tapped the folder like he was warning me of a cliff. "She's desperate, Justin. Desperation makes people dangerous." That made sense in the ledger way of things, the number that drives behavior, but it didn't explain the surveillance, the plans tucked under the door, the handwritten notes with times and angles. Numbers are motives. Obsession is action. Someone was combining both. We started documenting everything. Angela taught me how to catalog timestamps, photo context, witness statements. She labeled files like evidence, used the spreadsheet I'd mocked in early days to keep track of lawnmower noises. We kept receipts, took neighborhood photos, and most nights we sat with the porch light off and watched the street through a slit in the curtains. It felt ridiculous and essential at the same time, like paranoid people who had finally been proven right enough to be taken seriously. Officer Harris came by again, this time with sharper eyes and the kind of patience shaped by years of seeing pettiness become peril. He walked the property slowly, feet crunching on gravel, clipboard tapping in his hand. He didn't lecture or moralize, he listened. "This started with paperwork," he said, looking at the pile on our kitchen table. "And it'll escalate if left unchallenged. You've done the right thing collecting this." He made a note to increase patrols in the neighborhood and told us to call immediately if anything crossed into criminal behavior. But there was worry in his voice, like a man who'd seen what denial on a block could do. Then the lawyer turned up again, Henderson this time with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. He left papers that read like threats coded in legalese. Angela folded them precisely and stacked them with the other documents. "This is just theater," she said, almost bored. "They're trying to create legal fear where none exists." There was something in the way she said it that made me wonder how many times she'd encountered similar bluster before. It wasn't just familiarity. It was the kind of expertise that's neither accidental nor casual. Neighbors started splitting into subtle camps. Betty still knocked with O-shaped cookies and whispered concerns about safety. Mike kept one eye on the street and the other on the HOA financials. A few others crossed the lawn with hesitant glances, offering platitudes that didn't hide their discomfort. "We're a community," one neighbor told me awkwardly, as if that could stitch all this back together. But communities, I learned in those days, are made of people, and people are complicated. Some will stand up when pushed. Others will drift away to the comfort of plausible deniability. The tension brought with it small, sharp domestic moments. I'd find Angela staring at her phone in a way I'd never seen, hard, private. Once I caught her standing in the kitchen doorway at 2 a.m, whispering into the handset like she was reading a plan in code. The words I could catch were clipped into fragments. Assess, protocol, escalation. I remembered the anonymous email and the photographs on the table and felt a kind of vertigo. The realization that I'd been married to someone whose day-to-day existence carried weight I didn't fully understand. Late one night around 3 a.m., our phone lit up again. Angela answered with that smooth, professional cadence that made me feel like a museum piece. She listened, then moved away from the window. When she came back, her face was different, less composed, more concentrated. "We need to tighten our perimeter," she said softly, voice low with urgency I hadn't heard before. "There's chatter I don't like." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Sometimes asking questions is like touching a bruise. It hurts and makes the wound show. The neighborhood itself began to change in the small hours. Cars parked where they shouldn't. A dark sedan once showed up across the street and lingered until dawn. When it left, the license plate shimmered like it had been assigned from a different universe. I'd see it at odd hours, half hidden, and once I nearly swore I saw someone watching us through the tint. We started pulling curtains at dusk, leaving the house in shadow like an animal in a burrow. And yet, despite all the creeping fear, there were moments that felt almost ordinary. Angela planting a pot of basil on the back step, the squeak of our gate when I came home, the neighbor kid's bicycle bell at noon. Those tiny normalcies anchored me. They were proof that life could still exist inside surveillance. They were also the things Diane was trying to erase, the comfortable patterns that make a house a home. Then one evening, everything shifted in a single electric moment. Diane came to our door not with a clipboard this time, but with half the neighborhood behind her, faces lit by porch light and phone screens. She marched up our walkway with the confidence of someone who thought a crowd would be her shield. I watched from the window while Angela straightened a loose curtain and walked to the front, and in that motion, something inside me tightened like a held breath. Diane didn't knock. She called out across the lawn, dramatic and loud. "We deserve to know what you people are doing in this neighborhood." Her voice had that practiced, righteous ring to it, the kind that expects applause. The crowd murmured, the night held its breath, and I realized this wasn't about dues anymore. This was about exposure, about forcing a private life into public judgment. Angela opened the door. She looked at the crowd, at Diane, then back at me with an expression I couldn't read. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the rawness of standing on display, seen, measured, and lined up for verdict. Whatever came next, I knew it would change everything. Have you ever stood on your own front porch while half your neighborhood pointed at you like you were a headline? That was the feeling when Diane marched up our walkway with a crowd behind her, phones out, faces bright in the porch light, breath fogging in the cool air. It's one thing to feel judged by a stranger, it's another to feel the whole block leaning in, waiting for you to explain your life. She didn't bother with introductions. She planted herself on our driveway and began speaking as if she had a microphone. "We need answers," she announced, voice sharp enough to slice through the whispering. "There are surveillance activities, suspicious behavior, something is being hidden from us. We have a right to know what's happening on our street." The words were practiced, and the crowd hummed, some curious, some outraged, some merely entertained by the spectacle. I remember the small, ordinary details. A kid's bike leaned against the curb, its bell spattered with morning dew, the warm scent of someone's takeout drifting from a nearby doorway, the way Mike's boots scuffed the concrete as he shuffled forward. Those small things made the whole scene feel unbearably intimate, like watching a private argument replayed in a glass box for everyone to see. Angela appeared in the doorway with that calm professionalism I'd come to both admire and fear. She stood there for a long breath, tall, composed, eyes even. For months she deflected questions, kept the nature of her work private. Now, with a crowd assembled like an audience, something shifted. Her voice when she spoke was quiet at first, then it carried in a way that made people strain to hear. "Mrs. Parker," she said slowly, "you've been documenting our house. You've posted, you've circulated photos, you've made allegations. You have been warned by law enforcement about your behavior. What do you expect will happen if you continue?" There was no anger in her tone, only a dangerous kind of clarity. Diane's answer was a frantic litany of conspiracy and righteousness. She launched into a tirade about accountability and corruption, about people who hide behind vague job titles and pretend their private lives are above scrutiny. Her face was flushed, her notebook clutched like a talisman, and somewhere in the crowd someone started recording with a phone, the red light blinking like a tiny accusation. And then Diane did something I still can't explain. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911 in full view of everyone. "I need officers here immediately," she said into the receiver, voice brittle but loud enough for the whole street to hear. "There's a woman claiming to be the county sheriff at this address. I think she's impersonating law enforcement and abusing power." The absurdity of it landed like a stone in a calm pond, heads turned, phones tilted. A silence spread that felt thicker than fog. Angela's face didn't change, her hands didn't tremble. She folded her fingers and looked straight at Diane, and her voice, when she finally spoke again, had a simple, undeniable weight. "My name is Angela Roberts. I am the county sheriff." The 3 words landed like thunder in the quiet night. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of crickets and the distant hum of an air conditioner. You could watch the room rearrange itself around that revelation. Surprise, then comprehension, then a ripple of embarrassment that spread across Diane's face like a stain. Phones dropped a few inches as people processed what they'd seen. The person they'd been vilifying was not only within the law, she was its head in our county. The irony was so thick it felt almost flammable. Diane's mouth opened and closed without sound. For once, the practiced cadence of her accusations faltered into something that looked like fear. "This is entrapment," she stammered, as if that word could rewind months of surveillance and flyers and anonymous notes slipped beneath doors. "You hid your job to trap us. This is corruption." "Mrs. Parker," Angela cut in, steady and measured, "what you have done is criminal. Stalking, trespassing, willful harassment, attempted electronic surveillance, these are not civic duties, they are crimes." Her words pulled the air taut, like the string of a bow ready to release. In less than 10 minutes, the quiet street filled with the wail and shimmer of patrol lights. Someone had evidently already called, maybe a neighbor, maybe Diane's panicked 911 report, maybe someone who heard the tone of things and thought, this is a problem. 2 squad cars rolled to a stop, engines idling, the officers moving with a practiced caution that suggested they'd seen neighborhood spectacles before. But there was something different in their faces when they saw Angela. A subtle lift of eyebrows, a tiny nod, an immediate recalibration. Officer Smith was the first to step forward. She'd been the one who had initially cautioned Diane and who'd come out to our house weeks earlier to inspect supposed violations. The way she looked at Angela was less like a subordinate greeting a superior and more like a colleague recognizing someone who'd been in the same hard places before. "Good evening, Sheriff," she said, voice steady. "We received a 911 call reporting impersonation." She glanced at Diane, who still clutched her notebook like a lifeline. "Care to explain?" Diane launched into the story with theatrical energy, numbing grievances, pointing at photos on her phone, finding in every line an imagined justification for what she'd done. The officers listened with faces that slowly shifted from professional neutrality to polite disbelief. When they asked for evidence of the impersonation, Diane fumbled. Her phone's recordings, some partial, some out of context, didn't add up. Her neat little notebook, once looked over, revealed not civic concern but obsessive notes. Subject shows tactical awareness, recommend caution, notes on vehicle positioning. The word surveillance glared from the page. I watched the neighbors' expressions change. Some flushed with guilt, others looked away. A few clutched their phones like shields. There's an ugly thing that happens when a crowd realizes it's been weaponized. Faces fall, alliances fray, people try to pretend they'd always been on the other side. Officer Smith's voice was careful but firm. "Mrs. Parker, we have documentation here of stalking behaviors, trespass, and attempted electronic surveillance. You will need to step away from this property." She turned to Diane with an officer's gravity that swallowed the performative outrage on Diane's face. "There may be criminal charges pending." Diane's bravado cracked into a mop of excuses. She tried to blame neighborhood safety, to cast doubt on Angela's motives, to make herself a victim of some imagined conspiracy. But the officers had seen the photos, the notebooks, the pattern of escalation, and the evidence sat on our table like a stack of plain, irrefutable facts. They read it, exchanged a few quiet words, and then asked Diane to come with them to discuss the matter at the station. As they led her to the patrol car, the hush that had descended over the street felt like a release. Some neighbors leaned forward to watch, unable to look away, others retreated into their houses, embarrassed and small. Mike came up to the porch and clapped me on the shoulder with a grip that meant little and everything. "You guys did it the right way," he said, the words clumsy but sincere. Inside the house, after the officers left and the neighborhood had resumed its uneasy rhythm, Angela closed the door and leaned against it like a person who had just stepped off of a tightrope. For the first time since this nightmare began, her shoulders sagged a fraction as if something heavy had been lifted. She looked at me then, really looked, and the woman I'd married, the one who laughed at my terrible jokes and kept our cupboards labeled, was still there. But she was also something else. Someone who had walked a line between duty and privacy and had chosen to protect us without spectacle. She sat at the kitchen table and folded her hands around a mug. The house was quiet in that peculiar post-storm silence. "I wanted to keep this from you," she said finally, voice low. "I didn't think it would spiral like this. I wanted to ask 100 questions about her work, about why she'd hidden it, about the darker things she hinted at when she said more complicated, but instead I reached out and took her hand. You didn't have to tell me all of it to be my wife," I said. It felt true and incomplete at the same time. Doing the right thing had consequences, and some of them were still waiting at the edge of our street. That night, as we drew the curtains and double-checked the locks, I felt both chastened and proud. Chastened because I realized how easily a community can be steered by a single, persistent voice. proud because the woman beside me had carried a burden I hadn't known and protected us with steady hands. Outside, somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and then was still. The neighborhood breathed, tentative and raw, and for the first time in months, I slept with a door that felt solid and a future that felt cautiously like ours again. Have you ever walked down your own street after the storm has passed and realized nothing looks the same anymore? That's how it felt the morning after Diane was taken away for questioning. The air was oddly clean, the sidewalks wet with sprinklers, kids back on their bikes. On the surface, it was all normal again. But I could feel it in the glances, neighbors looking out through curtains, some nodding too quickly when I waved, others ducking back like they'd never been part of the crowd that showed up on our lawn. Angela and I stepped out to grab the paper, and the neighborhood hummed with that nervous quiet you get after a tornado skirts past. People wanted to pretend things hadn't happened, but you could see the fractures. Betty, sweet as ever, crossed the street with a covered plate of muffins. Her hands trembled just enough to make the napkin slip. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. I didn't realize how far she'd gone. We should have spoken up sooner. Her apology felt heavy, like it belonged to all of them. Mike came by later, shaking his head, boots caked in dust. He leaned against our fence, voice low. "Half the folks are embarrassed, other half are scared. Nobody wants to admit they believed Diane's stories, but plenty did. You were the lesson, Justin, you and Angela. People saw how fast a neighbor can turn a street into a courtroom." He spat into the grass, then looked me dead in the eye. "You stood firm, not many would have." I didn't feel firm. I felt tired, hollow, like someone had wrung the air out of me. The mailbox still bore faint residue from the taped citations. Our welcome mat was frayed at the edges where someone had dragged it down the street. The patio door still had those scratches from the night someone tested our locks. Every mark was a scar, proof of how fragile ordinary life can be when one person decides to rewrite the rules. That evening, Angela sat me down at the kitchen table, her hands folded, her eyes steady. "You deserve the truth," she said simply. And for the first time, she told me more than the vague county administration line. She told me about the task force work, about overseeing compliance that sometimes meant handling people who didn't want to be handled, about threats and anonymous letters that had followed her before. She told me she never wanted that world to spill into our home, into our garden, into our quiet dinners. "That's why I never said much," she admitted. "I wanted this place to be ours, untouched." Hearing it didn't shock me as much as it clarified things. The way she had analyzed Diane's tactics, the precision of her note-taking, the calm under pressure, it all made sense. And yet part of me ached, because I realized how long she had carried that weight alone, how much she had shielded me not with walls but with silence. The fallout wasn't cinematic. Diane didn't vanish into handcuffs forever. She was questioned, warned, and released. The HOA scrambled, its lawyer ducking out of sight, board members pretending they had known nothing. Some neighbors quietly withdrew their support, others muttered about how unfair it all seemed, as if accountability were a punishment instead of a consequence. But the energy was gone. The machine Diane had built, flyers, meetings, late-night patrols, collapsed without her obsession to power it. Still, traces remained. A few anonymous comments showed up on our porch camera feed. A broken bottle was found near our driveway one morning. The hostility didn't evaporate, it just went underground. And in some ways, that felt worse, like walking through a room where the lights were off but you knew someone was there. But then there were moments that reminded me why we'd chosen this place in the first place. Mike waving from his truck with a half grin, Betty's muffins left on our doorstep with little notes of apology, the sound of kids laughing in the sprinklers. Even Officer Harris driving by slow one afternoon, rolling his window down just enough to say, "You too, hang in there." Things like this have a way of teaching a whole community what lines not to cross. Angela and I rebuilt our rhythm. We pulled the curtains back open. She replanted her basil. I finally set up my bookshelves in the garage. Life, tentative and bruised, stitched itself back together, but I saw the changes in both of us. Angela's eyes were sharper, more watchful. I double-checked locks twice instead of once. Neither of us ignored the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk anymore. And yet in the quiet evenings, as we sat on the porch watching the sun slip low behind the houses, there was something else too, a kind of pride. Not the loud kind you announce, but the quiet, stubborn pride of surviving something that tried to unmake you. Sometimes I'd catch Angela looking at the horizon, her face soft in the fading light. "It could have gone worse," she'd murmur, and I knew she was right. Sometimes survival doesn't feel like victory until you realize the alternative. The moral wasn't clean, it never is, but I carried one truth from all of it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't fight back loud or match someone's rage with rage. Sometimes the strongest thing is to endure long enough for the truth to show itself, even when everyone else is looking away. That truth had cost us months of fear, sleepless nights, and more than a few broken illusions about community. But it had also reminded me of who my wife really was, and who we could be together even when the world around us tried to make us something else. And in that quiet, when the porch light flickered on and the street settled into uneasy peace, I found myself whispering a thought I hadn't dared during the storm. Maybe we'd finally made this place a home. Have you ever caught yourself holding your breath just walking to your own mailbox? That's what life felt like in the weeks after Diane's fall. The neighborhood looked calmer, but beneath the surface there was this undercurrent, like the hum of wires you can't quite see. The loud drama was over, but the quiet tension remained. Some neighbors waved again, quick and sheepish. Others pretended not to notice us at all. Betty kept bringing little offerings, pies, muffins, even a loaf of banana bread, but her eyes never lingered long, like she was afraid someone might see her being too friendly. Mike, though, didn't change. He'd stop by with small updates, sometimes about HOA finances unraveling, sometimes just to talk about weather and football. His presence was a reminder that loyalty could still exist, even in a street fractured by fear. The HOA scrambled to clean up. They issued an email saying Diane had temporarily stepped aside, as if she'd gone on vacation instead of being caught orchestrating surveillance. The lawyer vanished into quiet embarrassment. The board shrank into itself, avoiding questions, but the scars stayed. Anonymous notes still appeared once or twice, typed now, not handwritten, slid under our door with vague warnings about keeping quiet or knowing your place. I saved everyone. Angela logged them in her spreadsheet with the same precision as before, but I could see her jaw tighten each time. Nights were the hardest. A car idling too long outside made us freeze. A motion alert from the porch camera jolted me awake. Even small noises carried weight. Once at 2 a.m., the wind slammed the gate shut, and I found myself standing in the living room barefoot with a hammer in my hand, chest heaving like I'd run a mile. The body doesn't always believe what the mind tries to tell it. Angela, though, never once reached for panic. She moved through each day steady, sharper than ever. She adjusted her routines again, checked locks twice, varied her routes. One evening, as we sat with mugs of tea at the kitchen table, I asked her if this was just how she lived, if this was what her job had trained her to expect. She looked at me for a long moment, then said softly, "I've seen what happens when people underestimate obsession. It's easier to prevent than to repair." It wasn't the comfort I wanted, but it was the truth. The community itself tried to heal in awkward fits and starts. Someone organized a block barbecue, but half the neighborhood skipped. At those who came, conversations felt strained, laughter forced. I stood there with a paper plate of hot dogs, aware of every glance that slid toward Angela. Some eyes held curiosity, some unease, a few respect. No one spoke of Diane directly, but her shadow hung over the folding tables like smoke. Then came the day of the county announcement. Angela stood in uniform at a press conference, badge glinting, posture steady, words calm. I watched from the back of the crowd as reporters scribbled and cameras clicked. She wasn't my wife in that moment. She was the sheriff. And I realized for the first time just how much she had tried to protect me by keeping her professional world outside our home. When the clip aired that night on local news, phones in the neighborhood lit up. Some neighbors congratulated her with cautious pride. Others fell silent, realizing the woman they doubted, mocked, or targeted was the very person responsible for their safety. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Diane's name never appeared in the reports, but everyone here knew the story between the lines. The shift was subtle but real. No more flyers, no more late-night suspicious activity. The tension didn't disappear overnight, but it loosened. People started mowing their lawns again without looking over their shoulders. Kids biked later into the evening. Even the silence changed from watchful to ordinary. Yet for me, normal never quite returned. I'd walk the block and see where old flyers had once been stapled, or glance at the curb where Diane had gathered her crowd and feel echoes. Not ghosts, not fear exactly, just reminders. Proof that trust, once broken, doesn't patch easily. One night, as Angela and I sat on the porch, I asked her what she thought of it all now that it was over, or as close to over as it would ever be. She sipped her tea, eyes following the streetlights flicking on one by one. "People will forget," she said. "They'll tuck it away because remembering makes them uncomfortable, but we'll carry it, that's the price." I let her words sink in, heavy and true. She was right. People forget the storms once the sun returns. They remember the story in fragments, not the weight, but for us, the lesson was carved deep. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about endurance. It's about holding steady long enough for the lies to collapse under their own weight. And as I sat there with the sound of the gate creaking in the wind and Angela's hand warm on mine, I realized endurance is a kind of victory all its own. Have you ever woken up one morning and realized the war you've been fighting is finally over? Not because the enemy was destroyed, but because their power to scare you has faded away? That's what the last chapter of this ordeal felt like. Not fireworks, not a dramatic ending. Just the quiet return of ordinary life, the kind that feels more precious because you almost lost it. The house began to breathe again. Curtains were pulled open. Porch lights stayed on through the night, not as warnings, but as simple markers of home. Angela replanted the vegetable garden she'd abandoned months earlier, her hands moving through soil with the patience of someone reclaiming ground. I put my tools back in the garage where they belonged instead of keeping them stacked by the door like weapons. Slowly, the rooms of our home shifted back from barricade to sanctuary. The neighborhood, too, adjusted. Diane moved away quietly after her reputation crumbled. Rumors swirled, a job lost, debts unpaid, family tensions, but the details didn't matter. What mattered was that her absence felt like a weight lifting off the block. The HOA limped along under new leadership, reduced to sending out dull newsletters about pool hours and holiday lights. The theatrics were gone, the fear had drained. And yet I carried the memories like invisible scars. Every time I heard a car idle too long outside, I still felt that old twinge in my chest. Every time I walked out to get the mail, I half expected to find another citation taped to the door. It's strange how harassment embeds itself into muscle memory. But scars aren't only signs of wounds, they're also proof of healing. Neighbors started stopping by in quiet, awkward ways. Betty brought cookies again, this time with no nervous glances over her shoulder. Mike dropped off a stack of old magazines and said, "Thought you might like these," in his usual gruff way, though we both knew what he really meant was, "I'm glad you're still here." Little by little, we weren't pariahs anymore. We were just neighbors again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas buzzed in the trees, Angela and I sat on the porch, the same place where it had all begun. The street looked so ordinary, kids chasing each other, sprinklers hissing across lawns, the faint smell of charcoal drifting from a backyard grill. Ordinary and yet extraordinary because we'd fought to keep it. Angela's voice broke the silence. "Do you ever wish I'd told you sooner?" she asked. Her eyes were steady but softer than I'd seen them in months. I thought about it, about the months of not knowing, the anonymous photos, the sleepless nights, the reveal on the porch when she finally spoke the truth, and I shook my head. "No," I said, "because the way I found out showed me who you really are, not just my wife, not just my partner, but someone who stood her ground when most people would have folded. That's not something words could have told me, I had to see it." She didn't answer right away. She just reached over, took my hand, and for the first time in a long while, her shoulders eased. The lesson I carry from all of this isn't neat. It isn't the kind you stitch on a pillow or frame on a wall. It's messier, heavier. It's this: sometimes the people who seem the quietest are carrying the most strength. Sometimes the fight you don't want finds you anyway, and the only way through is to hold steady while the storm spends itself. And sometimes survival isn't loud, it's a whisper, it's a light left on, it's a garden replanted. As the night deepened and the street settled into calm, I found myself breathing differently, slower, fuller. The fear that had haunted us didn't vanish, but it no longer owned us. What owned us was the choice we'd made: to stay, to endure, to claim our place not with anger but with persistence. And maybe that's the truest kind of justice. Not the kind that comes in flashing lights or courtroom victories, but the kind that lets you sit on your porch at the end of a long fight, hold your partner's hand, and know you didn't let anyone take away the life you built together. That night, as the gate creaked gently in the wind and the neighborhood finally, mercifully, felt like home again, I realized we hadn't just survived Diane, we had outlasted her. And sometimes that's the only victory you need. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.